Welcome to a short history of English puddings. In this presentation, I'll be running through, very quickly, pudding history. And then we'll be going into a historic kitchen. I'll be looking at the places where they would have made the puddings in that kitchen. And from the final part, the third part, we'll be looking at 3 different recipes for puddings and how they interrelate. First, a bit about me. So my name is Paul Couchman. I am the Vinci cook. My background, I studied art history, and in the 1990s I got a taste for cooking for groups when I helped to set up a squatters restaurant in Amsterdam. At the moment I teach about historic cookery and about history of cooking, and I'm very lucky to do that in a historic kitchen which is in Hove, which is next to Brighton, right by the seafront, in a very beautiful 1830s house, which is here. So if these were different times, and if I wasn't speaking to you on video, I could take you into this house. We wouldn't go in the front door, which is here. No, we'd go down this gate here and go and enter into the basement. The basement, as you probably know, is where the servants lived and sometimes, well, they worked and sometimes lived. So the first room we come across on this little tour is the housekeeper's room. So she has the room at the front. Then we go down the corridor here to the servants' hall, which you can't see, which is behind the staircase here. So that's where the servants eat, and they also keep their possessions there. There's a staircase going upstairs there. This room here is the butler's pantry. You have another staircase that goes upstairs, this time a very small one, mainly used just by the servants. And at the very back, I think the most important room in the whole house is the kitchen. And when you're in the kitchen, if you hear horses, you haven't imagined that. It's because up here, behind you, as you cook, are horses. There's a stable at the back. And 2 other rooms I'll point out. You've got a room here, which is the coal room. So that's where would have held the coke for the stoves. And here is a scullery where the washing up is done. I'm just going to show you inside here. So the coal room that I told you about is through that door there. Through this glaze section here, you have the scullery. And this is the main kitchen. Have a quick think. If this was an interactive presentation, or if this was the interactive presentation I did, this is the part when you'd type in your favourite pudding. So have a little think. What pudding do you like? And I can give mine. And I'm going to give mine with a little story, because when I was 12, we had cookery classes at school. And the first pudding I ever made was something called Queen of Puddings. And it was still warm at the oven when I took it home, so I cradled it in my arms. And if I remember rightly, I ate the whole thing on the way home on the bus. So I presented an empty bowl to my mother, who wasn't that pleased. But that was my first pudding. So that is my favourite pudding. What's yours? I'd love to know. So here's a few different puddings. The list is endless, but here are a few. Bread and butter, bread pudding, cabinet pudding, Christmas pudding, Eve's pudding. Eve's pudding has got apples in it. There's something wonderful called a fruit hat here. And then we have Queen of Puddings, my favourite, rice pudding, and spotted dick. Fascinating. So what is a pudding? I'll give a quick definition here of what a pudding is. I'll just grab my notes as well to do it. So a pudding is the name of a mixture, and it can be sweet or savoury, and it's cooked in either, so there's a few different options. It's either cooked in animal skins, that can be skins or intestines, like a sausage. It can be cooked in a pudding cloth. It can be cooked in a pudding basin. It might be cooked in a tray, like a Yorkshire pudding. Or it could be cooked in pastry. And that would be, a good example of that would be a Bakewell pudding. And that's luckily coming up later in the presentation. So when were the first puddings? Now, unfortunately, we don't know. There is no evidence of Neolithic puddings. There are no recipe books, and there is no archaeological evidence of puddings. It's a real shame that. But, the food writer Bakewood from Belgium suggests in her book, which I'll pop in the book list at the end, she suggests that there probably were Neolithic puddings because it's a very sensible thing to do. If you've slaughtered an animal and you've got all these bits left over after you've eaten all the main meat, so things like all the offal, you've got blood and you've got intestines, the sensible thing would be to combine them into making some sort of pudding. So for example, a blood pudding or a sausage. It seems sensible that those things were made and then boiled. So you've got they could boil water. I mean, we've been boiling water for 10,000 years, so they can boil water. So it's likely that they made puddings and boiled them, but we have no evidence that they did. The first evidence of puddings comes when we look at the Roman recipe books that were left over, and there are recipes in these Roman cookery books for puddings. So there's two types of puddings, actually. And this is nice because it all ties in together later. But we have savoury puddings. We have recipes for Roman savoury puddings. So that's black pudding and white pudding. Black pudding is made with blood and cereal encased in intestines. And white pudding is made again with cereal. And it's made either with chicken or pheasant or pork inside. And I just wanted... This is wonderful. There's another thing they had, which is called salvium, if I'm saying it right. It's a Roman cheesecake that's made with curd cheese, and it was baked in an oven. So the Romans knew how to do this, but unfortunately, for a long period, this knowledge disappeared. And just quickly here as well, this is the first literary reference to a pudding. And this woman here is Penelope. And she's the wife of Ulysses, who's gone off for 10 years. And while he's away, these men turn up. So these are all the suitors that were looking for Penelope's hand in marriage. And you can see there's gold, there's roses, there's jewelry, there's all these attractions. Penelope will have none of it. But while the men were there, what they feasted on were puddings. So if you look here, there were some goat paunches down at the fire, which we have filled with blood and fat and set aside for supper. So this is in Homer, and you've got the first reference to puddings. Isn't that wonderful? Now I'm going to do licenses now and rush through history. But I will mention on the way pottage. So we're getting up to the 16th, 17th century now. But pottage was eaten right back from the start. So pottage is a name for a thick soup or stew, which is made by boiling vegetables, grains, and if available, meat or fish. And this was a staple food for many centuries. And what happened, and as I say here, if you were poor, you ate it, and you might not have any meat in your pottage. If you're rich, you might have fish or meat, and you might even have dried fruits, spices in it. So the food that the rich and poor ate was very similar, but just with these added extras, depending on your wealth. And so pottage, if you think about it, look down here, it's just a sort of liquidy mix. And then somebody came across the idea. We've got a reference to it in the medieval period, but it didn't really take hold until about the 1590s. So somebody decided to use a piece of cloth and then take, things like these pottages, you can wrap them up in a cloth and then you can boil them and they become quite stiff and solid inside. And so there you have a pudding. So that's the invention of the Puddingcloth, which revolutionises the things that could be made as puddings. Because if you think about it, you no longer need animal skins, you no longer need intestines. And so the fillings gradually could become sweeter and more interesting. So I just want to say there's two sorts of puddings that were made in Puddingcloths, basically anyway. You've got the very solid puddings that we know of as Christmas pudding, and this is one here which I made. but you also have the more liquidy type of puddings. So if we go back, thinking about that cheesecake, so, something like eggs and flour together, and you can wrap that up in a pudding cloth, and it's going to become a bit more liquidy when it's cooked, a bit more like a cheesecake, a bit more soft and a bit quaking. So they actually called it quaking pudding. So we've got a sort of liquidy quaking pudding in these pudding cloths, or very solid. Things like peas, pottage as well, which become nice and solid as well. So puddings can be either solid or liquid. Okay, so we skip now to 1690. This is, let me just move myself down, if I can. I can't. Oh, there we go, yeah. M. Mission. So he is a French visitor to England, 1690, it says there. Blessed be he that invented puddings, for it is a manner that hits the palates of all sorts of people. The people never weary of it. So puddings began to become famous all over Europe. So people knew about our puddings, and it's very much an English thing. Other people don't really have them. No, I don't know why that is. That's just something that happened. So I talked about puddings and pudding cloths. But if you think about the contents of a pudding cloth, if you've got the facilities, you can bake them. And if you're very clever, you'll make pastry and bake them in the oven. And what's really interesting about all of these puddings, if you think about all the different sorts of puddings we have, most puddings started off as boiled puddings. And then eventually they sort of migrate and they change and they become baked puddings. But often, if you look at all these, there's a few examples here: Eve's pudding, chestnut pudding, burnt cream, carrot pudding, Bakewell pudding. These are all possible inside a pudding cloth, and they actually were all done in pudding cloths before they became these sort of baked puddings, which the elite enjoyed. Because if you think about it, especially at this period, and actually right up to the middle of the 19th century, an oven was something that only rich people could afford to use. You had baking ovens in special purposes, but people inside their own homes wouldn't have had ovens. The only people that would have them were people in the royal circle or the nobility or people further down than that. But when you get down to the middle classes and the other people at this time, in this early period, they don't have ovens. That comes later. So you get a pudding explosion. These are just a few of the puddings that I've managed to pop onto the slide. And as you can see, there are loads more. What's lovely is you get people, famous people. I've got the Duke of Buckingham here. I've got Lord Barrington. Puddings, and I've got a Baroness up here as well. Puddings become fashionable. People think it's an honour to have themselves named after a pudding. And I love here, we've got Aunt Nellie as well, who's suddenly come in. And what's funny about all these puddings, and especially when you study it, you can see that a lot of the puddings are actually very similar. So there's isn't much variation on the theme. There's very tiny differences and stuff, but actually we've got a few basic puddings. And different things and different flavours are added to them, but a lot of them are very similar. But I will go into that with some different puddings. So at the same time as the puddings explode, we also got a whole explosion in cookery books. So between 1700 and 1800, more than 300 cookery books were published. Many were written by women, and many were written for women in the household as well, because early in the period it was very much men in the kitchen, and you get this period where women start coming into the kitchen and being quite influential. And if you think further through to Eliza Acton, which I've got the book here somewhere, or also to Mrs. Beeton, you've got these very famous women cookery writers. So this is lovely. It's behind me in the cupboard up there. So there's a little story about this. So this is a manuscript cookbook, and a manuscript cookbook is basically a collection of recipes which have been put together, often taken from other sources, and they've been collected together by somebody, very beautiful, handwritten, and then passed through. And very luckily, this one survived. This is we think from the 1830s. It's very nice because the kitchen I work in is roughly 1830s as well. So it's a book that could have been in the kitchen. So you've got this lovely collection, and I've turned it obviously to the page on puddings. Got Mother's Eve's pudding, which I mentioned earlier is an apple pudding. Look, another Duke's pudding. It doesn't say which Duke, but it's Duke's pudding. Lemon pudding here, and a chestnut pudding there. Beautiful. So I've been mentioning the townhouse. You saw the diagram through the townhouse, and you saw me take you to the kitchen. And here we are. This is the kitchen. This is the door to the coal cellar, and this is the dresser, which you probably haven't seen yet. But what puddings would they make at the townhouse, at this lovely 1830s kitchen? What puddings would they make there? Well, we think. Show you the oven. I mean, we don't have the oven anymore, but luckily one of the neighbours still has in their garden, where the kitchen was demolished, they actually have the old range. That's the range that would have gone in our chimney breast here. Do you see? What's lovely, if you look here, this is the side of the oven, and the ovens are very hot, obviously, and this has burned a hole here, or burned a scorch mark, I should say, in the side there, so you can actually see how high the oven was. And look over here, that's how high it is. So that's the oven. So obviously, the townhouse was built for very wealthy people who would have enjoyed baked puddings, and the puddings would have been baked in the oven here. But it also, we have between 8 to 12 servants at the townhouse, and they would have enjoyed puddings as well, but we think they probably would have had them in the copper. So next to this range here in the chimney, on this side of it, there would have been a copper which looks like this. And a copper is basically, it's got a fire underneath, do you see? A little fire. And a copper at the top, so that's a sort of copper basin that would have been filled with water, and it would have been heated. And in that you mainly do laundry, but often when it's not being used for laundry, you can also steam or boil puddings. Look, and here's a massive pudding that this woman is really having trouble getting into the copper. So puddings. 2 places for puddings. So this is the third section now of the presentation. I've got 3 recipes for you, which I hope will go back to what we've talked about before and what you've listened to. So Sussex plum pudding, Bakewood pudding, and of course, a Christmas pudding. So now this is an old recipe for Sussex plum pudding. I'll read it out. It's from 1672 because I love the language. So take a little cold cream, butter and flour with some beaten spice, eggs and a little salt. Make them into a stiff paste. Then make them into a round ball and you mould it. Put in a piece of butter in the middle and so tie up hard in a buttered cloth. That's the pudding cloth. And put it into boiling water and let it boil apace till it be enough. Then serve it in and garnish your dish with barberries. When it is at the table, cut it open at the top and there will be, as it were, a pond of butter. I'll leave it there, but if you don't know what Sussex pond pudding is, let me show you one. What's interesting about that, if you think back to that recipe, it had butter inside, and what happens is when you slice the pudding, the butter comes out and makes a pond around the pudding. Later on, people start putting lemons in the Sussex pond pudding, and people think it's completely traditional that you have these lemons in the pudding, but actually that's a later thing. The original Sussex pond pudding had butter inside it. But the reason I've chosen Sussex pond pudding is it's a hybrid pudding because it starts off being steamed. Later on, it's served baked in the oven, as this one is here. So do you see? And actually, baked puddings are nicer. They are nicer. But traditionally, it was boiled. So something I said back earlier, do you remember? The idea of puddings first being boiled and then being baked. Here's a good example of one. And so my second example will show that as well. Bakewood pudding. So if you, I don't know, hopefully you've eaten a Bakewood pudding. It's a great pleasure. The Bakewood puddings we get at the moment, or Bakewood tarts that we get at the moment, tend to have a sponge layer. In this example, you don't have that. You have a sort of liquidy layer. I'll read out the recipe and you can see what goes into it. It's actually very simple, and I've made it, and it's very, very delicious. So Bakewood Pudding. This is from about 1835. Line a dish with some fine puff pastry and spread it over a variety of preserves with strips of candied lemon peel. Then fill the dish with the following mixture: half a pound of butter, which has been clarified, half a pound of caster sugar, 10 yolks and 2 whites of eggs. Flavour with either bitter almonds, lemon, nutmeg or cinnamon. These ingredients to be well mixed but not beaten up. Bake in a moderate oven. When cold, grate white sugar over the pudding. So a Bakewood pudding. Let me show you what it looks like. So it is a pudding. So there we go. Eggs and butter baked in a pastry case. But originally the pastry case wasn't there. The pudding would have been a sort of quaking pudding, which I mentioned earlier. So you put the mixture, that mixture would have gone into a pudding cloth, baked, and you get a sort of quaky sort of pudding. But later they how can I say it, poshed it up. They put it inside a pastry case and baked it. So that would have been elite pudding at some point. I mean, now, if you think about it, terrible, isn't it? But now you can Bakewood tarts, Bakewood puddings, you can get in corner shops and they cost relatively nothing. But it was an elite pudding in the beginning. So we go on to the Christmas pudding. And this Christmas, if you're looking for a new recipe for Christmas pudding, please do try Eliza Acton's pudding. So Eliza Acton, have I got her book next to me? I do. So Eliza Acton, if you haven't seen this, I really strongly recommend it. And this is a lovely new edition by Quadrille Press, I believe. Really beautiful. All the original recipes. And Eliza Acton was in the 1840s. So her recipes could have been used in the townhouse. I just read it out because I love it. So the author's Christmas pudding. To 3 ounces of flour and the same weight of fine, lightly grated breadcrumbs, add 6 of beef kidney suet, chopped small, 6 of raisins weighed after they are stoned, 6 of well-cleaned currants, 4 ounces of minced apples, 5 of sugar, 2 of candied orange rind, half a teaspoon of nutmeg mixed with pounded mace, a very little salt, a small glass of brandy, and 3 whole eggs. Now listen to the method. Mix and beat these ingredients well together. Tie them tightly in a thickly floured cloth and boil for 3.5 hours. We can recommend this as remarkably light, small, rich pudding. It may be served with German wine or punch sauce. And what's lovely here, just a bit of history about recipes. Eliza Acton was the first person to actually list. Do you see all the ingredients listed at the bottom? The method is here at the top. Later on, Mrs. Beeton would swap that round, so she put the ingredients first and the method second, which is the recipe, the way of seeing recipes that we know from today. But this is where it all comes from. So Eliza Acton was the first person to actually do this. It's very orderly. And here we go. And if you have an 1830s kitchen at your disposal and you have an 1840s recipe, you've got to try it out, haven't you? So we did. So every Christmas, I think the last 2 Christmases, we've been making puddings in the townhouse from Eliza Acton's recipe. And if you look here, we have this wonderful pudding bowl that was given to us came from a cook in Tunbridge Wells who gave lots and lots of things, and every year this bowl comes out and we all mix this together, and then everyone makes a tiny little pudding in a pudding cloth. So the tradition carries on. So I'm almost to the end now. I've got some recommendations for cookery books for further reading. Jane Grigson's English Food was the first food history book I got, and it's a really good starter because she's a very good story writer, and it's a very good introduction. So it's a secondary source, as it were. I mean, primary source is this one down here. So Eliza Acton's, they are the original recipes. And again, that's not too tricky. It's not too tricky to follow them. So I'd recommend you getting that. But obviously, for a lot of this presentation, I've drawn on these two books actually. So Mary Norwork, that's an older book. I think it's 1980s. Maybe it's the 1990s reprint. That's English Pudding, Sweet and Savory. Very good. She's a good writer too. And this one is beautiful. Let's see. I do have it next to me here. I can just leave quickly doing this. Show you. Maybe you can see some of these beautiful illustrations. And if you're really into puddings, it also smells beautiful. Many books smell beautiful. So this is, let me just say her name. It's a Belgian name. Roly Esfine. Her Pride of Puddings is a must. It really is a must. And we've got this lovely Lost Food of England, which is a massive collection of recipes, which is really worth getting as well. So all original recipes from all periods, actually. That's really worth getting. So those are some books. And I wanted to go on to this last thing. Let me just see. Because I got a question while I was... so I did this presentation originally for Heritage Open Days for, on people on Zoom. But I got this question on Twitter and I wanted to answer it directly. I'm going to have to crib my notes to make sure I pronounce the name right. But Shoma, I hope this is right. Shoma McLean on Twitter. She asks, where did puddings come from? What led to the drive for soft food versus, say, stew? So it's a lovely question. And basically, you probably know the answer now. I hope maybe Shoma does already, but I can just reiterate. Where did puddings come from? So puddings originally were savoury. So blood pudding is a very good example, or even haggis. They're both good examples of original puddings. What led the drive for soft food versus, say, stew? Soft food we've always had. So basically, remember I look back at pottage, soft food. It's always been there. Someone had this lovely idea of making it into a pudding. So that's where soft food comes from. And soft food, if you go back, you remember that Roman cheesecake right from the beginning. We've always had a desire for soft food. And we actually had ways of making it as well, which disappear and then come back again, luckily. So two things I want you to take away from this presentation. One, well, probably more actually, but two things. Think back to that Roman cheesecake. It's delicious because you serve it with honey and what they're called poppy seeds as well over the top. It's delicious. So remember that and do seek it out. It's great to make. And what's the second thing? Eliza Acton's Christmas pudding. If there's one Christmas pudding you're going to make this year, do try that out. It's delicious. And you'll be making a striped pudding. Thanks very much for listening to this presentation. And I hope to see you soon. I've got another slide with my website. Oh, and I'm going to have to move myself out. But you can probably guess it's www. So that's my website. Please come along. Say hello. Say you've seen this presentation. Thanks for listening.